The November fog hung thick as treacle over Baker Street when Inspector Lestrade's urgent knock shattered the evening's tranquility. Holmes, who had been examining a curious sample of tobacco ash beneath his magnifying glass, set down his instrument with the deliberate precision that marked all his movements. "Come, Lestrade," he called before the inspector could announce himself. "That particular gate upon our 17 steps belongs to no one else, and your haste suggests a matter of considerable urgency." The inspector burst through our door, his face flushed with exertion and bewilderment. "Holmes, thank Providence you're in. We have a most confounding business at the Lyceum Theatre, a death that defies all natural explanation." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with that familiar gleam I had learned to associate with his most celebrated cases. "Pray be specific, Lestrade. The night is young, and impossibility is merely another word for insufficient observation." As our hansom clattered through the fog-shrouded streets toward Covent Garden, Lestrade provided the essential facts. Sir Reginald Ashworth, the distinguished banker and theatrical patron, had been discovered that morning behind the great velvet stage curtains of the Lyceum, stone dead, without a mark upon him. The theatre had been locked and secured after the previous evening's performance, with multiple witnesses confirming that no soul had entered or departed thereafter. Yet somehow, Sir Reginald had materialized in that forbidden space to meet his mysterious end. The Lyceum loomed before us, like a sleeping giant, its ornate facade barely visible through the yellow murk. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with more than fog, the mingled scents of grease paint, old velvet, and something indefinably sinister that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Mr. Bartholomew Finch, the theatre manager, met us in the grand foyer, his usually florid complexion now pale as parchment. "Gentlemen, I have managed this establishment for 20 years, but never have I encountered such a devilish puzzle. Sir Reginald was our most generous patron, yet he lies dead in a place where no living man should be." Holmes moved through the corridors with that peculiar bird-like quickness which marked his most intense investigations. The stage itself was a cathedral of shadows, its towering fly galleries disappearing into darkness above. Behind the massive velvet curtains, in a narrow space between the backdrop and the rear wall, lay Sir Reginald Ashworth. He appeared to have died peacefully, seated upon a small wooden crate, his evening dress immaculate, and his face wearing an expression of serene contentment that seemed almost supernatural in its tranquility. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, kneeling beside the body with his magnifying glass. "The gentleman's boots show traces of sawdust, yet the stage floor is swept clean. His left cuff bears a curious stain, theatrical rouge, unless I am mistaken, and see here a fragment of playbill clutched in his right hand." He indicated a torn scrap of paper bearing part of an actress's name. "Most intriguing of all, note the faint scent of almonds about the person, and this peculiar discoloration beneath the fingernails." Lestrade wrung his hands in frustration. "But Holmes, how did he enter? Every door was bolted from within, every window sealed. The night watchman swears no one passed him, and the stage door remained locked with 3 separate mechanisms, all undisturbed until this morning's discovery." Holmes rose slowly, his keen gaze traveling from the velvet curtains to the fly ropes above, from the narrow space where death had claimed its victim to the pristine stage beyond. "The facts, as you present them, Lestrade, suggest an impossibility. Yet here lies Sir Reginald, indisputably dead and equally indisputably present. Therefore, our assumptions about the nature of his arrival must be fundamentally flawed." He paused, that thin smile playing about his lips which I had learned to associate with the unraveling of the most complex puzzles. "This promises to be a most instructive case indeed." Holmes's attention shifted from the peaceful countenance of Sir Reginald to the stage floor beneath our feet, where his keen eyes detected what lesser minds would dismiss as theatrical debris. "The sawdust here tells a most revealing story, Watson," he murmured, kneeling to examine the scattered particles with his magnifying glass. Observe the pattern, not the random distribution one would expect from ordinary stage maintenance, but rather deliberate trails leading from this precise spot toward the wings. His long fingers traced invisible lines in the air above the evidence. Someone has taken considerable care to obscure their movements, yet sawdust, like time itself, preserves the truth of all passages. Lestrade shifted impatiently beside me, his practical mind clearly struggling with Holmes's methodical approach. But how does sawdust explain a locked theatre? Holmes, the man is dead. The doors were secured, and we're no closer to understanding this impossibility. Holmes rose gracefully, brushing dust from his knees, and that familiar gleam of discovery brightening his grey eyes. Impossibility, my dear Lestrade, is merely possibility wearing a clever disguise. Finch, I require access to the area beneath this stage immediately. The theatre manager produced a heavy ring of keys with trembling hands. The understage workshops, Mr. Holmes, but they were locked at the close of last evening's performance. No one has been down there since someone required privacy for their nocturnal preparations. Holmes interrupted, his voice carrying that edge of certainty which marked his most significant deductions. The trapdoor, if you please. The hinges protested with a rusty groan as the concealed entrance revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness below. Holmes descended first, his lamp casting dancing shadows across walls, lined with theatrical properties and carpenter's tools. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of paint, glue, and something else, something that made my medical training prickle with unease. Watson, observe this workbench, Holmes called, his light illuminating a surface covered with fresh wood shavings and an array of small bottles. Recent activity, despite Mr. Finch's assurances of security. And here, he lifted a small brush stained with theatrical rouge. We have the source of our victim's curious cuff marking. A gruff voice from the stairway announced the arrival of Tom Jenkins, the head carpenter, his weathered face creased with concern. Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but I heard voices down here. Nothing should be disturbed in my workshop without. Holmes turned to face the newcomer, his expression sharp with interest. Mr. Jenkins, your timing is fortuitous. I trust you can explain the recent use of your facilities despite the theatre's supposed security. The carpenter's eyes darted nervously between the evidence on his bench and Holmes's penetrating gaze. Well, sir, there was some repair work needed on the fly ropes after last evening's performance. Nothing unusual, mind you, just routine maintenance that couldn't wait for morning. Holmes nodded slowly, lifting one of the bottles to examine its contents in the lamplight. Routine maintenance requiring spirit gum and stage makeup, most illuminating. Tell me, Jenkins, did Sir Reginald ever express interest in your work down here? Funny you should ask, sir, Jenkins replied, his voice growing more animated. The gentleman had been asking all manner of questions about the theatre's construction these past weeks. Particularly keen on understanding the rope systems and how the scenery moves, said he was writing some sort of article about theatrical mechanics for his banker's journal. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me, his eyebrows raised slightly. Indeed. And did he ever visit your workshop personally? Jenkins scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. Just once, sir. About a week past. Seemed mighty interested in the counterweight system and kept asking about access routes between different parts of the building. Made me uncomfortable. Truth be told, gentlemen of his station don't usually concern themselves with such matters. Holmes carefully replaced the bottle, his movements deliberate and precise. Most enlightening, Mr. Jenkins. I trust you'll remain available should we require further consultation. As we climbed back to the stage level, Holmes's expression had assumed that distant quality, which invariably preceded his most brilliant insights. The pieces begin to arrange themselves, Watson, he murmured, gazing once more at Sir Reginald's serene form. Our banker was not merely a patron of the arts, but a student of architecture and perhaps a victim of his own curiosity. Holmes's keen observation about Sir Reginald's architectural curiosity proved prophetic as his examination of the wooden crate revealed fresh scratches along its edges, the kind made when heavy objects are dragged across dusty surfaces. "This makeshift seat was positioned with deliberate care, Watson," he murmured, running his fingernail along the parallel grooves. "Observe how the hollows are packed with sawdust, while the ridges remain clean, moved within the last day, I should say." He lifted the edge of the great velvet curtain experimentally, and I noticed how the slightest disturbance sent tremors through the fly ropes high above, causing the entire rigging system to whisper with mechanical sympathy. "The counterweights," Holmes said softly, his grey eyes following the network of ropes ascending into darkness. "Jenkins mentioned recent adjustments to the forest scene drop, yet here." He indicated a small canvas bag tied discreetly within the counterweight frame. "Someone has added a whisper of sand to alter the precise balance. A minor shift at the right moment would move these heavy curtains with the gentleness of a sigh, creating the perfect opportunity for concealment or revelation." Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of a woman whose presence commanded immediate attention. Miss Cordelia Ashford swept onto the stage with the natural grace of one accustomed to commanding audiences, though her usual theatrical bearing was tempered by genuine distress. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her trained voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "I am the company's leading lady, and I feel compelled to share certain observations about poor Sir Reginald that may illuminate this dreadful mystery." Lestrade stepped forward eagerly, his practical mind seizing upon the prospect of a cooperative witness. "Miss Ashford, any information you can provide would be most welcome. How well did you know the deceased?" She adjusted her dark shawl with unconscious elegance, her eyes moving between Holmes's penetrating gaze and Sir Reginald's peaceful form. He had become quite a regular patron over recent months, Inspector, but his interest extended far beyond our performances. Sir Reginald had developed what I can only describe as a fascination with the technical aspects of our productions, the machinery that creates our stage illusions, the methods by which we conjure magic from mere mechanics. Holmes moved closer, his attention sharpening with that familiar intensity I had learned to associate with significant revelations. "Elaborate on this fascination, if you please. What specific elements captured his interest?" Miss Ashford's expression grew thoughtful as she gazed up at the complex rigging system. He was particularly intrigued by our ghost effects, how spirits appear and vanish, how voices seem to emanate from empty air. He spent considerable time with our stage manager, discussing trapdoors, counterweight systems, even the acoustical properties that allow supernatural illusions to seem utterly real. The implications struck me with sudden clarity, and I saw Holmes's eyes narrow as the pieces of his mental puzzle began arranging themselves. "Did Sir Reginald ever request private demonstrations of these effects?" Miss Ashford nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the spot where death had claimed its victim. "On several occasions, yes. He was most generous with his patronage, and we were happy to accommodate his curiosity. He claimed to be researching an article about theatrical mechanics for his banking journal, though his interest seemed far more personal than professional." Holmes had returned to his examination of Sir Reginald's still form, and I observed him carefully studying the faint discoloration beneath the victim's fingernails, a subtle purplish hue that my medical training immediately recognized as consistent with certain forms of poisoning. The persistent scent of bitter almonds that Holmes had noted earlier now seemed more sinister in its implications, particularly given the victim's expression of serene repose rather than the distress one might expect from violent death. "Mr. Finch," Holmes called suddenly, his voice cutting through our contemplation, "I require complete architectural plans of this theatre, with particular attention to substage areas, fly galleries, and any unusual structural features. Additionally, I must speak with every individual who was present in this building last evening, regardless of how peripheral their duties may have seemed." The manager stammered his immediate compliance, dispatching an assistant to retrieve the requested documents. Holmes stood silently for a moment, his silhouette framed against the vast empty stage, already weaving together the invisible threads of evidence into a coherent pattern. The stage, Watson, he mused quietly, is not merely a place for a performance, but often for the most elaborate deceptions. And this particular theatre, I begin to suspect, has been the setting for a performance far more sinister than any scripted drama. The architectural plans spread before us revealed the Lyceum's true complexity, a maze of forgotten passages and mechanical systems that transformed the grand theatre into something resembling an elaborate puzzle box. Holmes traced his finger along a faded line, marking what appeared to be a disused service corridor. "Most illuminating," he murmured, his grey eyes following the passage as it wound beneath the stage and connected to a small private box. This tunnel was sealed decades ago, yet observe these pencil marks, recent annotations in a hand I suspect we shall soon recognize. Mr. Finch leaned closer, his face growing pale as he studied the markings. "Those notations weren't on the original plans, Mr. Holmes. Someone has been studying our building's secrets with considerable thoroughness." Holmes nodded grimly, then lifted his magnifying glass to examine a small smudge on the paper's edge, a trace of the same theatrical rouge we had discovered on Sir Reginald's cuff. "Indeed, and our mysterious student has left calling cards at every turn." Our contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Elias Thorne, the theatre's resident illusionist and technical director. Thorne cut an imposing figure, tall and gaunt, with piercing dark eyes and hands perpetually stained with the tools of his trade. His reputation for jealously guarding the secrets of his craft was legendary throughout London's theatrical circles, and his volatile temperament had made him few friends among the company. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the resonant quality of one accustomed to commanding attention, "I understand you're investigating poor Sir Reginald's unfortunate demise. I feel compelled to share certain observations about the gentleman's recent behavior." Holmes straightened with that familiar sharpening of attention that marked significant developments. "Pray continue, Mr. Thorne. Any insights you can provide will be most welcome." The illusionist's expression darkened as he spoke of Sir Reginald's persistent inquiries into the technical aspects of stage magic. "The man had become obsessed with understanding our methods, Mr. Holmes. He pestered me constantly about the mechanics of my disappearing acts, the engineering behind our ghost effects. Most disturbing of all, he claimed to have discovered financial irregularities in the theatre's accounts, transactions that shouldn't exist, records that had been altered without proper authorization. This revelation struck me with sudden force, as it connected Sir Reginald's banking expertise with his theatrical interests in a most sinister fashion." Holmes's eyes had taken on that distant quality which invariably preceded his most brilliant insights. "These financial irregularities, did Sir Reginald specify their nature?" Thorne shifted uncomfortably, his stained fingers working nervously at his apron. "He mentioned something about funds being diverted through accounts connected to our neighboring building, the offices of Pemberton and Associates. He seemed to believe his investigation had placed him in considerable danger." Lestrade, ever eager for a clear path forward, seized upon this development with visible satisfaction. "So we have motive, then someone with access to both the theatre and the financial records. Someone who knew Sir Reginald was closing in on their scheme." Holmes, however, remained focused on the physical evidence, his attention drawn to a peculiar detail in Thorne's workshop, visible through the open door. Among the various stage properties and mechanical devices, a small lockbox sat conspicuously open, its contents apparently disturbed. "Mr. Thorne," Holmes said quietly, "that box appears to have been recently accessed. Do you customarily leave your tools and materials unsecured?" The illusionist's composure wavered slightly. "Certainly not. My workshop is sacrosanct. Nothing is ever disturbed without my knowledge." Yet, even as he spoke, I observed Holmes noting the fresh scratches around the lock mechanism and the faint dusting of sawdust that had accumulated on the box's interior, the same distinctive sawdust we had been tracking throughout our investigation. Holmes straightened slowly, his keen gaze moving from the disturbed lockbox to the architectural plans and finally to Thorn's increasingly nervous demeanor. "The threads begin to weave themselves into a pattern," he murmured, his voice carrying that edge of certainty which marked his most significant deductions. "Though I suspect the true design will prove far more intricate than our initial observations suggest." Holmes's examination of the lockbox's contents revealed an array of theatrical supplies that made my medical training prickle with immediate concern. Among the usual assortment of spirit gums and stage adhesives lay several small vials of clear liquid, one of which Holmes lifted with particular care to examine in the lamplight. "Prussic acid," he observed quietly, his voice carrying that methodical precision which marked his most significant discoveries. "A substance with legitimate applications in certain photographic processes used for theatrical backdrops, yet possessing rather more sinister capabilities when concentrated to this degree." Thorn's face had grown ashen as Holmes continued his examination, the illusionist's earlier composure completely abandoned as he stammered explanations about routine chemical supplies and standard maintenance procedures. "The vial is nearly empty," Holmes noted, his keen eyes moving between the container and the serene expression on Sir Reginald's face, visible through the stage opening. "Yet your inventory records would suggest it was recently full." The bitter almond scent we detected about the victim's person now assumes a rather more ominous significance. Our tense examination was interrupted by the arrival of a well-dressed young man whose bearing spoke of privilege tempered by genuine distress. Miss Ashford stepped forward to make the introduction. "Mr. Holmes, this is Mr. Geoffrey Ashworth, Sir Reginald's nephew and heir. He has information that may prove crucial to your investigation." The young man stepped forward with evident reluctance, his hands trembling as he produced a bundle of papers from his coat pocket. "Uncle Reginald had been receiving threatening letters," Geoffrey explained, his voice barely steady. "Anonymous messages warning him to abandon his inquiries into certain financial matters connected to various theatrical investments. He showed me several last week, claiming they were becoming increasingly specific about the consequences of continued investigation." Holmes accepted the correspondence with that careful precision he reserved for crucial evidence, his trained eyes immediately noting the expensive paper stock and distinctive watermark. "Harrod's finest stationery," Holmes murmured, holding one sheet to the light. "Yet the ink shows signs of having been mixed with theatrical rouge to alter its natural color, a technique that would be familiar to anyone working regularly with stage makeup." His meaningful glance toward Thorn did not go unnoticed by any of us, and I saw Lestrade's hand move instinctively toward his handcuffs. At that moment, a young stagehand approached, nervously, cap in hand. "Begging your pardon, Inspector," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I overheard Mr. Thorn last night after the performance, arguing with someone near the stage door. Very heated it was, sir, and I distinctly heard him threaten to make them disappear for good if they didn't keep quiet about something called the Pemberton money." Thorn's theatrical training served him well, as he scoffed at this testimony. "Arthur is a flighty boy with an overactive imagination, Inspector. I was merely rehearsing lines for a new illusion. The phrase, 'make them disappear,' is rather common in my profession, wouldn't you agree?" Yet even as he spoke, I observed Holmes studying the architectural plans with renewed intensity, his finger tracing a particular section where the theater's wall met the neighboring building. "Most illuminating," Holmes said softly, indicating a faded marking on the blueprint. "This ventilation shaft, officially sealed decades ago, once provided direct access between this theater and the offices of Pemberton and Associates. The dimensions suggest it would accommodate a determined individual, and these recent pencil annotations," he indicated fresh marks on the aged paper, "suggest someone has been studying this connection with considerable interest." Holmes straightened slowly, his grey eyes moving from the disturbed lockbox to the threatening letters, from the architectural plans to Thorn's increasingly agitated demeanor. The pieces were arranging themselves into a pattern, yet I sensed my friend recognized complexities that remained hidden from the rest of us. "The evidence accumulates with remarkable convenience," he murmured, his voice carrying that edge of suspicion which invariably preceded his most brilliant revelations. "Perhaps too convenient for a mind as methodical as our perpetrator has proven to be." Lestrade, ever eager for a clear resolution, seemed poised to arrest Thorne immediately, yet Holmes raised a cautionary hand. "Patience, Inspector. The stage is set for revelation, but the final act has yet to commence. Our illusionist friend may indeed hold the key to this mystery, though perhaps not in the manner we currently suppose." His keen gaze swept the theatre once more, taking in every detail of the elaborate setting where death had claimed its victim. "The truth, I suspect, will prove far more artful than our present assumptions suggest." Holmes's observation about artful truth proved prescient, as his renewed examination of the threatening letters revealed subtleties that had escaped our initial scrutiny. "Watson," he murmured, adjusting the angle of one missive to catch the stage lighting more precisely. "Observe how the ink shows minute variations in opacity, not the natural flow of urgent correspondence, but the careful deliberation of theatrical prop-making." His magnifying glass revealed tiny particles of rouge mixed with the ink, the same theatrical pigment we had discovered throughout our investigation. Someone with intimate knowledge of stage techniques has gone to considerable trouble to create the illusion of external threat. Geoffrey Ashworth's face grew pale, as Holmes continued his methodical deconstruction of what we had assumed to be evidence. "But Uncle Reginald showed me these letters personally, Mr. Holmes." His fear seemed entirely genuine. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his keen eyes studying the young man's distressed expression with that penetrating intensity I had learned to associate with significant insights. "Fear, Mr. Ashworth, can stem from guilt as readily as from external menace. Your uncle's terror may have been entirely real, yet directed inward rather than toward some anonymous adversary." This revelation prompted Holmes to examine the architectural plans with renewed purpose, his finger tracing the sealed ventilation passage between the theatre and the neighboring offices. "The modifications to this shaft are recent," he observed, indicating fresh pencil marks on the aged blueprint. "Yet the work has been done with considerable skill to avoid detection. Someone familiar with both buildings has created a private conduit for clandestine meetings." He lifted his lamp to illuminate a section of wall where subtle variations in mortar indicated recent disturbance. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Charles Pemberton himself, whose presence at the theatre seemed remarkably fortuitous given the evening's tragic circumstances. The gentleman's bearing spoke of established wealth and careful cultivation, yet I detected a nervous energy beneath his composed exterior that my medical training recognized as the symptoms of sustained anxiety. "Inspector Lestrade," he announced, his voice carrying practiced authority, "I came immediately upon hearing of Sir Reginald's unfortunate death. Our firms have maintained certain discreet financial arrangements that may require clarification." Holmes turned his full attention to this unexpected arrival, his grey eyes noting every detail of Pemberton's expensive attire and the subtle tremor in his hands. "These discreet arrangements, do they involve the movement of funds through accounts connected to theatrical investments?" Pemberton's composure wavered slightly, though he maintained his dignified bearing. Sir Reginald had been assisting with complex transactions involving overseas touring companies. Entirely legitimate business, though the documentation might appear irregular to untrained observers. The implications struck me with sudden clarity as I recalled Sir Reginald's persistent questions about theatrical mechanics and his fascination with the technical aspects of stage illusions. Holmes, meanwhile, had begun examining the counterweight system with particular attention to the small canvas bag of sand he had noted earlier. "Mr. Finch," he called to the theatre manager, "this modification to your rigging system, when was it implemented?" Finch's face grew noticeably pale as he stammered about routine maintenance and seasonal adjustments. At that moment, Holmes made a discovery that shifted our entire understanding of the case. Behind the counterweight housing, concealed within the complex rigging system, lay a small leather portfolio containing detailed financial records in Sir Reginald's meticulous handwriting. The documents revealed a web of transactions far more complex than simple embezzlement, a sophisticated scheme involving the transfer of funds through theatrical investment accounts, with meetings conducted in the secure privacy of the theatre's hidden spaces. The ventilation shaft provided perfect access, Holmes observed, his voice carrying that edge of certainty which marked his most significant deductions, while the theatre's acoustic properties ensured complete privacy for sensitive discussions. Sir Reginald's knowledge of stage mechanics made him invaluable for orchestrating these clandestine encounters, yet his banker's conscience eventually proved incompatible with continued deception. He paused, his keen gaze moving between the assembled suspects as the true complexity of the conspiracy began to emerge. Thorne, who had remained silent during these revelations, suddenly stepped forward with an expression of dawning understanding mixed with indignation. The man wasn't investigating financial irregularities, he was orchestrating them. The counterweight adjustments, the modified rigging, even his questions about our technical systems, all designed to facilitate his private meetings with co-conspirators. Holmes nodded slowly, yet I detected in his expression that familiar skepticism which invariably preceded his most brilliant insights. Indeed, Mr. Thorne, yet the convenience of this revelation troubles me greatly. The evidence arranges itself too neatly, the conclusions emerge too readily. His grey eyes swept the theatre once more, taking in every detail of the elaborate setting where death had claimed its victim. I begin to suspect that we are witnessing not the resolution of this mystery, but merely the end of its first act. The true performance, I fear, has yet to commence. Holmes's suspicion about the case's convenient resolution proved prophetic as his renewed examination of the financial portfolio and revealed subtle inconsistencies that challenged our emerging understanding. "Watson," he said quietly, his magnifying glass hovering over the meticulously arranged documents, "observe these theatrical symbols scattered throughout Sir Reginald's supposedly private records, notations that belong not to banking terminology, but to stage management." His keen finger traced a series of small marks that I had initially dismissed as mere ink blots, yet under closer scrutiny revealed themselves as deliberate annotations in a hand distinctly different from the banker's careful script. Miss Ashford stepped closer, her trained eye immediately recognizing the symbols Holmes had identified. "Those markings belong to our prompt book system," she exclaimed, her voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "A notation method used exclusively by our company to coordinate scene changes and actor entrances. Only someone with intimate access to our rehearsal materials would understand their significance, let alone employ them in financial documentation." The implications struck me with sudden force. Someone within the theatre company had been systematically altering Sir Reginald's legitimate records to create the illusion of conspiracy where none had previously existed. Our contemplation was interrupted by young Arthur's hesitant approach, his cap clutched nervously as he addressed Holmes with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Holmes, sir, I've been reflecting on what I witnessed last evening, and I fear I may have been mistaken about Mr. Thorne's involvement." The voice I heard making threats, it possessed a refined accent, the speech patterns of someone educated in better circumstances than most of us theatre folk. This revelation cast our previous assumptions in an entirely different light, as both Pemberton and Geoffrey Ashworth possessed the cultured tones Arthur had described. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his attention returning to the stage floor where the sawdust patterns told a story more complex than we had initially supposed. The scattered particles suggest not a single person's movements, but rather a carefully orchestrated gathering, he observed, his magnifying glass revealing multiple sets of footprints converging near the spot where Sir Reginald had met his end. Someone with considerable knowledge of theatrical techniques has staged this entire scene, employing the very skills that create illusions upon this stage to obscure the true nature of our victim's final moments. Geoffrey Ashworth's composure had deteriorated markedly as Holmes's deductions systematically dismantled the narrative of external threats and financial conspiracy. Uncle Reginald's fear was entirely genuine, he stammered, his hands trembling as he spoke, yet perhaps not for the reasons I initially believed. In recent weeks, he had grown increasingly troubled by something far more personal than business irregularities, something that threatened relationships he valued above mere financial considerations. The young man's distress seemed authentic, yet I detected in his manner the carefully controlled anxiety of one harboring significant secrets. Holmes straightened slowly, his grey eyes moving between the forged documents and the assembled individuals whose lives had intersected in this theatrical setting. The playbill fragment still clutched in Sir Reginald's hand caught his attention once more, and he examined it with renewed interest. This scrap bears not only the partial name of an actress, but traces of a distinctive perfume jasmine, unless my senses deceive me. Combined with the theatrical symbols in the financial records, it suggests our victim's final encounter was far more intimate than any business meeting. Pemberton's nervous energy had intensified throughout Holmes's analysis, the gentleman's earlier composure completely abandoned as the true complexity of the deception became apparent. The overseas transactions were entirely legitimate, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Yet I confess that certain meetings required discretion that may have appeared suspicious to outside observers. Holmes regarded him with that penetrating intensity I had learned to associate with significant breakthroughs. "Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said with deceptive mildness, "your explanations might prove more convincing were they not contradicted by the evidence before us. The theatrical symbols, the forged annotations, the carefully staged scene all point to a conspiracy far more personal than financial fraud." He paused, his keen gaze sweeping the theater as the true nature of the crime began to emerge. The stage has indeed been set for revelation, yet I suspect the final performance will prove far more intimate than our grand theories have suggested. The truth, as always, lies not in elaborate financial schemes, but in the simplest human emotions, love, betrayal, and the desperate measures people employ to protect their deepest secrets. Holmes's insight about intimate emotions proved prophetic as he orchestrated a careful reconstruction of the previous evening's events. "Mr. Finch," he instructed with characteristic precision, "I require a demonstration of your counterweight system exactly as it operated last night. The mechanical truth will illuminate what human testimony has thus far obscured." Directing the stagehands to their positions, while Holmes observed every detail of the rigging system's operation, with that penetrating intensity I had learned to associate with imminent revelation. As the great velvet curtains moved with funeral solemnity, Holmes's keen eyes detected something that had escaped our earlier examination, a small envelope wedged deep within the counterweight housing, its edges stained with the same theatrical rouge that had marked our investigation from the beginning. "Watson," he murmured, extracting the correspondence with delicate care. "Observe how this missive has been deliberately concealed, yet positioned for eventual discovery. Our perpetrator employs the same theatrical principles that govern stage magic misdirection, followed by calculated revelation." The envelope bore Sir Reginald's name in feminine handwriting, its paper scented with that distinctive jasmine fragrance we had encountered throughout our investigation. Holmes opened it with methodical precision, revealing a brief note that spoke of passionate declarations and desperate resolutions. "My dearest Reginald," he read aloud, his voice carrying through the theater's acoustic perfection. "Tonight, we must end what should never have begun. The scandal threatens to destroy us both. Yet I cannot bear to see you suffer any longer. Meet me behind the velvet curtains where our story began, and we shall find peace together." Miss Ashford's theatrical composure wavered visibly as Holmes revealed the correspondence, though she maintained her dignified bearing with admirable skill. "That handwriting," she whispered, her trained voice barely audible in the vast space. possesses characteristics I recognize, though I hesitate to make accusations without absolute certainty." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his grey eyes studying the actress's distressed expression while simultaneously noting the subtle reactions of our other suspects. At that moment, Geoffrey Ashworth stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his earlier composure completely abandoned as the true nature of his uncle's final hours became apparent. Uncle Reginald had been receiving correspondence of this nature for several weeks, he admitted, his voice trembling with emotion. Though he refused to discuss the identity of his correspondent or the nature of their relationship, his behavior had grown increasingly erratic, alternating between periods of euphoria and profound melancholy that suggested affairs of the heart, rather than mere business concerns. Holmes examined the envelope's watermark with his magnifying glass, revealing details that cast our previous assumptions in an entirely new light. "Harrod's finest stationery," he observed, yet treated with theatrical spirit gum to alter its natural texture, a technique that would require intimate knowledge of stage properties and their applications. "The author of this correspondence possesses skills that extend far beyond mere romantic correspondence into the realm of deliberate deception." Pemberton's nervous energy had intensified throughout this revelation, the gentleman's earlier explanations about legitimate business transactions now seeming woefully inadequate given the evidence of passionate romance and theatrical manipulation. "The financial arrangements between our firms," he stammered, his voice lacking all conviction, "may have provided convenient cover for meetings of a more personal nature, though I swear I had no knowledge of the true extent of Sir Reginald's emotional entanglements." Holmes straightened slowly, his keen gaze moving between the romantic correspondence and the carefully staged scene where death had claimed its victim. The prussic acid we had discovered, the serene expression on Sir Reginald's face, the elaborate theatrical setting all began to arrange themselves into a pattern far more complex than simple suicide or straightforward murder. "The evidence suggests," he said with that methodical precision which marked his most significant deductions, "that we are witnessing not merely the aftermath of romantic tragedy, but the culmination of a performance whose true nature has yet to be fully revealed." Lestrade, ever eager for clear resolution, seemed poised to arrest someone immediately, yet Holmes raised a cautionary hand as his attention returned to details that continued to trouble his methodical mind. The theatrical symbols scattered throughout Sir Reginald's records, the carefully timed discovery of evidence, the convenient arrangement of suspects and motives, all suggest a mind that understands not only the mechanics of stage illusion, but the psychology of criminal investigation itself. 10. Holmes moved toward the stage entrance with sudden purpose, his lamp casting dancing shadows across the ornate architecture as he examined areas we had previously overlooked. "Someone with intimate access to this theater has orchestrated events with the same precision employed in the most complex dramatic productions," he observed, his voice carrying that edge of certainty which marked his approach to final revelation. "The truth, I suspect, will prove far more artful than our present theories suggest, requiring not merely the solution of a crime, but the unmasking of a performance whose final act has yet to commence." Holmes's methodical examination of the stage entrance revealed a detail that transformed our entire understanding of the evening's events, a small mirror positioned with theatrical precision to provide perfect surveillance of the area behind the velvet curtains from the safety of the wings. "Watson," he called softly, his voice carrying that edge of triumph which marked his most significant discoveries, "observe how this reflecting glass has been adjusted to the precise angle necessary for complete observation without direct exposure. Someone required absolute certainty that their carefully orchestrated performance had achieved its intended effect." The implication struck me with sudden clarity as I realized that Sir Reginald's final moments had been observed, perhaps even directed, by someone positioned safely beyond immediate suspicion. Holmes nodded grimly as he noted my understanding, his keen eyes examining the mirrors mounting with his magnifying glass. "Fresh scratches along the adjustment mechanism," he observed. his voice carrying that methodical precision which marked his approach to complex deductions, indicating recent and repeated repositioning. Our perpetrator has been refining their surveillance technique over several evenings, perfecting the angle necessary for complete observation while maintaining perfect concealment. Miss Ashford's theatrical composure finally began to waver as the true sophistication of the deception became apparent, her professional training struggling to sustain the performance under Holmes's relentless analysis. "The romantic correspondence," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the theatre's vast space, "was indeed written in my hand, though perhaps not for the purposes you might suppose. Sir Reginald had been making certain requests of me, asking for my cooperation in matters that extended far beyond mere theatrical patronage." Holmes straightened with that familiar expression of pieces arranging themselves into coherent patterns, though his grey eyes retained their characteristic skepticism. "Elaborate, Miss Ashford. The nature of this cooperation may illuminate the true sequence of last evening's events." The actress gathered her dignity with visible effort, her trained voice regaining some of its professional clarity as she continued her careful revelation. Sir Reginald's interest in theatrical mechanics had indeed grown obsessive in recent weeks, she admitted, her gaze moving between the surveillance mirror and the spot where death had claimed its victim. Yet his fascination extended beyond mere curiosity into the realm of practical application. He spoke of needing to disappear, of escaping certain financial obligations that had grown beyond his ability to manage through conventional means. Holmes examined the romantic letter once more, his keen eyes detecting subtleties that had escaped our initial scrutiny. Yet this correspondence speaks of ending what should never have begun, and finding pieced-together language that suggests genuine emotion rather than mere criminal cooperation. Actress's expression confirmed his deduction, though she remained carefully silent as the full scope of the deception continued to unfold. At that moment, Holmes paused in his methodical analysis, his grey eyes sweeping the assembled company with that penetrating intensity I had learned to associate with his most brilliant insights. "The evidence arranges itself with remarkable convenience," he observed, his voice carrying a note of professional suspicion, "perhaps too convenient for a mind as methodical as our perpetrator has proven to be. The theatrical symbols, the forged correspondence, the precisely positioned surveillance equipment, all suggest an intellect that understands not merely the mechanics of stage illusion, but the psychology of criminal investigation itself." Lestrade shifted impatiently, his practical mind eager for clear resolution, yet Holmes raised a cautionary hand as his attention returned to details that continued to trouble his methodical analysis. "Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to provide us with a complete narrative." Yet the very completeness of that narrative suggests performance rather than spontaneous crime. We are witnessing not merely the aftermath of romantic tragedy, but the culmination of a theatrical production whose final act has yet to commence. Holmes moved toward the counterweight system with renewed purpose, his lamp casting dancing shadows across the complex rigging as he examined the mechanical elements that had featured so prominently in our investigation. "The stage has been set with the same precision employed in the most elaborate dramatic productions," he observed, his keen gaze taking in every detail of the theatrical machinery, "yet I suspect our director has not yet taken their final bow. The truth, as always in matters of this complexity, will require not merely the solution of a crime, but the unmasking of a performance whose most crucial scenes remain hidden behind the curtain of misdirection." Holmes's insight about theatrical performances proved prophetic as he orchestrated a final demonstration designed to expose the true architect behind Sir Reginald's carefully staged demise. "Mr. Finch," he instructed with characteristic precision, "I require the counterweight system positioned exactly as it operated last evening, and the surveillance mirror adjusted to its precise angle of observation. Our perpetrator employed these theatrical mechanisms with consummate skill, and they shall serve once more to illuminate the truth. As the theatre manager nervously complied with Holmes's instructions, I observed my friend's methodical preparation of what could only be described as an elaborate trap. He positioned a small bell, connected by horsehair, to the mirror's adjustment mechanism, spread French chalk across darkened muslin near the ventilation shaft, and carefully replaced the leather portfolio within the counterweight housing. "Watson," he murmured, his voice carrying that edge of certainty which marked his approach to final revelation. "Observe how our criminal employed the very principles that govern stage magic misdirection and concealment and the careful timing of revelation." Holmes examined the playbill fragment once more, his magnifying glass revealing details that transformed our understanding of Sir Reginald's final moments. "The prussic acid was not administered through conventional means," he observed, his voice carrying clearly through the theatre's acoustic perfection. "The poison was absorbed directly through the skin from a minute quantity applied to this very paper, a slow, insidious delivery that allowed for the serene expression we observed while requiring no struggle from the victim. This method demands not only chemical knowledge, but precise observation of its effects to ensure the performance proceeded as intended." The implications struck me with sudden clarity as Holmes indicated the surveillance mirror positioned to provide perfect observation of the space behind the velvet curtains. Someone had watched Sir Reginald's final moments from concealment, ensuring their carefully orchestrated crime appeared as natural death. The theatrical symbols scattered throughout the forged financial documents, Holmes continued, the romantic correspondence bearing Miss Ashford's handwriting, even the convenient discovery of threatening letters, all elements of an elaborate performance designed to obscure a far simpler motive. Our preparations were interrupted by the faint chime of Holmes's bell. Someone had disturbed the surveillance mirror in the darkness beyond our vision. The scent of jasmine drifted through the theatre's still air as a shadowy figure moved with practiced stealth toward the counterweight housing. Holmes's whistle cut through the gloom with surgical precision. And suddenly the stage blazed with light as Lestrade's men emerged from concealment. The figure trapped within our surveillance net was not whom I had expected. Geoffrey Ashworth stood revealed, his face pale with terror and guilt as the French chalk marked his sleeves like accusatory fingerprints. Yet even as Lestrade moved forward with his handcuffs, Holmes raised a cautionary hand, his grey eyes studying the young man's expression with that penetrating intensity I had learned to associate with incomplete understanding. "Mr. Ashworth," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying through the sudden silence, "your presence here confirms certain suspicions. Yet I suspect you are not the principal architect of this elaborate deception. The poison delivery method, the theatrical staging, the sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation all suggest a mind far more experienced in the arts of misdirection than your obvious distress would indicate." Geoffrey's composure collapsed entirely as he stammered, confessions about his uncle's gambling debts and desperate schemes for staged disappearance. Yet Holmes's expression retained that familiar skepticism which invariably preceded his most brilliant insights. "The nephew's guilt is genuine," he observed, his keen gaze sweeping the theatre once more. "Yet, guilt can stem from complicity as readily as from primary culpability. Someone with intimate knowledge of both theatrical techniques and criminal psychology has orchestrated these events with the precision of a master dramatist." Holmes moved toward the stage entrance with sudden purpose, his lamp casting dancing shadows across the ornate architecture as he examined details that continued to trouble his methodical mind. "The performance has reached its climax," he announced, his voice carrying that note of professional satisfaction which marked his approach to complete revelation. "Yet, I suspect our director has not yet taken their final bow. The stage, after all, is designed for multiple acts, and the most crucial scene remains hidden behind the curtain of our assumptions." Holmes's systematic exposure of the true architect behind this elaborate deception began with his methodical examination of the evidence that had accumulated throughout our investigation. The theatrical symbols scattered through Sir Reginald's financial records, he observed, his grey eyes moving between the forged documents and the assembled suspects, belong not to banking terminology, but to the prompt book system used exclusively by this theatre company. Yet only one person possesses both intimate knowledge of these notations and unrestricted access to Sir Reginald's private papers during his frequent visits to discuss theatrical mechanics. His penetrating gaze settled upon Mr. Finch, whose earlier helpful demeanor had gradually transformed into barely concealed anxiety as Holmes's deductions systematically dismantled the carefully constructed narrative. The architectural plans, bearing annotations in 3 distinct hands, reveal modifications to the ventilation system that predate Sir Reginald's supposed interest in theatrical mechanics by several months. These alterations were executed with the skill of someone who understands every mechanical nuance of this building. Someone whose position provides access to both structural blueprints and the tools necessary for clandestine modifications. Holmes moved toward the counterweight system with deliberate purpose, his lamp illuminating the complex rigging that had featured so prominently throughout our investigation. Mr. Finch, your intimate knowledge of this theatre's secrets has been invaluable to our inquiry, yet that same knowledge has ultimately provided the evidence necessary for your conviction. The surveillance mirror positioned for optimal observation, the precisely adjusted counterweight system, even the theatrical symbols used to forge Sir Reginald's financial records all represent your handiwork, executed to conceal systematic embezzlement over many years. The theatre manager's florid complexion drained entirely as Holmes produced the small vial of prussic acid we had discovered in Thorne's workshop. This particular vessel bears your fingerprints exclusively, despite your careful attempts to implicate our illusionist friend through circumstantial placement. The poison was administered through the playbill fragment clutched in Sir Reginald's hand, a method requiring intimate knowledge of both toxicology and your victim's habits. You observed his final moments through your carefully positioned surveillance mirror, ensuring your performance proceeded exactly as orchestrated. Holmes paused, allowing the weight of his accusations to settle through the theatre's perfect acoustics. Sir Reginald's discovery of financial irregularities threatened to expose years of systematic theft from theatrical revenues. His banker's training made him ideally suited to uncover the sophisticated methods you employed to conceal your embezzlement through multiple revenue streams. When his investigation grew too thorough, you exploited his genuine interest in theatrical mechanics to orchestrate this elaborate murder, employing every technique of stage illusion to create the perfect locked room mystery. The implications cascaded through my mind with stunning clarity as Holmes revealed the full scope of Finch's deception. The romantic correspondence bearing Miss Ashford's handwriting had been obtained through his position as theatre manager. The threatening letters fabricated using theatrical supplies, even Geoffrey's genuine guilt about his uncle's financial difficulties had been anticipated and exploited to provide perfect misdirection from the true motive. The counterweight modifications, the forged prompt book symbols, the precisely timed discovery of evidence, all elements of a performance designed to occupy investigators while obscuring the simplest possible explanation. Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of professional satisfaction which marked complete understanding. You understood that a sufficiently complex puzzle would focus attention on elaborate conspiracies rather than straightforward embezzlement, employing your comprehensive knowledge of both theatrical mechanics and criminal psychology to create an investigation that would exhaust itself pursuing false leads. Finch made a desperate final attempt to maintain his facade of cooperation, yet Holmes's relentless logic had exposed every element of the carefully constructed deception. With theatrical desperation befitting his profession, the manager suddenly activated the counterweight system, sending the great velvet curtains crashing down in a thunderous cascade of fabric and rope. In the confusion that followed, he attempted to escape through his carefully prepared ventilation passage, yet Holmes had anticipated this final dramatic gesture. Stage door is secured. Mr. Finch, Holmes called through the settling dust and fabric, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos. "And Inspector Lestrade's men have surrounded both buildings. Your performance has reached its inevitable conclusion." As the dust settled and order was restored, we found Finch collapsed near the ventilation shaft. His elaborate deception finally concluded. Holmes stood over him with that expression of professional satisfaction tempered by human understanding, which marked the resolution of his most complex cases. "The stage was indeed set for revelation, Mr. Finch," he observed quietly. "Yet the final act has proven far different from the performance you so carefully choreographed. The truth, as always, it has emerged through methodical observation rather than theatrical misdirection." Lestrade moved forward with his handcuffs as the full scope of the theatre manager's guilt became undeniable, yet I detected in Holmes's expression that familiar mixture of triumph and melancholy which invariably followed the conclusion of his most intellectually satisfying investigations. The Lyceum Theatre had indeed provided the perfect setting for this elaborate crime, yet it had also furnished the evidence necessary for justice to prevail through the inexorable logic that characterized my friend's most brilliant deductions. The aftermath of Finch's exposure unfolded with the mechanical precision that marked the conclusion of Holmes's most intricate cases. As Lestrade's men secured the theatre manager, his earlier theatrical composure had vanished entirely, replaced by the hollow resignation of a performer whose final curtain had fallen. The great stage, which had served as the setting for such elaborate deception, now witnessed the prosaic reality of handcuffs and official procedure, the velvet curtains hanging like silent witnesses to the drama's inevitable conclusion. Holmes observed the proceedings with that characteristic detachment which distinguished his professional satisfaction from mere triumph. "Mr. Finch understood the fundamental principle of theatrical misdirection," he remarked to Lestrade, his grey eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "Yet he failed to recognize that truth possesses an inexorable quality that no performance can ultimately obscure. His systematic embezzlement over nearly a decade required increasingly sophisticated concealment, and Sir Reginald's banker's scrutiny threatened to expose the entire enterprise." Geoffrey Ashworth sat upon a property trunk, his face bearing the weight of genuine remorse rather than criminal calculation. Holmes addressed him with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Your complicity stemmed from misguided loyalty rather than malicious intent. Mr. Ashworth, Finch exploited your uncle's gambling difficulties and your own desire to protect the family name, yet your actions were those of a nephew attempting to preserve dignity rather than a criminal seeking profit." The young man's relief was palpable, though tempered by the gravity of his uncle's death. Miss Ashford approached with her professional dignity restored, though the evening's revelations had clearly shaken her confidence in human nature. "The romantic correspondence, bearing your handwriting," Holmes explained, "was obtained through Finch's position and employed without your knowledge or consent. You have been victim rather than accomplice in this elaborate deception." Her grateful nod spoke volumes about the burden of suspicion she had carried throughout our investigation. Thorne, whose volatile temperament had made him an ideal suspect, extended his hand to Holmes with grudging respect. "You have cleared my name while exposing one who perverted our honest theatrical arts for criminal purposes," he declared, his earlier hostility transformed into professional appreciation. Even Pemberton's nervous energy had subsided as Holmes confirmed the legitimacy of his firm's discreet financial arrangements, separate from Finch's systematic theft. As we departed the Lyceum, the fog had begun to lift from the London streets, though the shadows of the evening's revelations lingered in my mind like the echo of distant applause. Holmes settled into our hansom with that particular satisfaction which marked the resolution of his most intellectually stimulating cases, his keen mind already processing the intricate deception we had unraveled. "The theatre provided the perfect metaphor for this criminal enterprise, Watson," he observed as our cab clattered through the awakening city. "Elaborate staging designed to obscure simple motives, complex performances serving the most basic human desires for wealth and self-preservation. Finch's intimate knowledge of both architectural mechanics and human psychology enabled him to create what he believed would be the perfect locked room mystery. Yet those same theatrical principles ultimately provided the evidence necessary for his detection. Back in our familiar quarters at Baker Street, Holmes settled into his chair with his pipe, the comfortable ritual marking our return to normalcy after the evening's dramatic revelations. The irony lies in Finch's employment of stage illusion to create his elaborate crime. He mused, thoughtful spirals of smoke rising toward the ceiling. He understood how to manipulate props and timing, how to position evidence and control narrative flow, yet he forgot that every performance must eventually face its audience. The most sophisticated deception cannot indefinitely withstand methodical observation. The morning papers would describe the case as another triumph of deductive reasoning, yet I knew Holmes found particular satisfaction in the intellectual challenge posed by Finch's sophisticated approach to both crime and concealment. The theater manager had indeed created a mystery worthy of the most elaborate stage production, employing every resource at his disposal to transform simple murder into an apparently impossible puzzle. The stage awaits its next performance. Watson, Holmes observed, rising to examine a telegram that had arrived during our absence. His eyes brightened with that familiar gleam of renewed interest. This communication from Inspector Bradstreet suggests a most intriguing matter involving a locked study and a vanished will. The game, as always, continues.